Hey moms, it's Nakimi. Welcome to the channel and space for single moms navigating motherhood. And as always, we do not bash the baby daddies because, well, we are here now. If you are new to the channel, welcome. We discuss all things pertaining to single motherhood. And I am a huge advocate of mental health for single moms. So if you are a single mommy looking for a community, please subscribe. Do not forget to hit the like button and leave me a comment at the end of the video. So mommies, today I want to tackle a very heavy topic that is making its rounds with social media. And, that is, how do you heal from being raised by a narcissistic parent? But I want to specifically hone in on the narcissistic moms, narcissistic single moms, right? This is a channel for my single mommies. What do you do? How do you heal from that? Now, when the internet really started talking about narcissism and narcissistic people, I didn't really know what that was, right? What were these symptoms and characteristics? So I kind of did a little Google, and I want to read you guys a little bit about what I was able to pull up. And some of the symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder are people that can have an unreasonably high sense of self-importance and require constant excessive admiration. They can feel that they deserve privileges and special treatment. They can be preoccupied with fantasies about success, power, brilliance, beauty, or the perfect mate. They believe that they are superior to others and can only spend time with or be understood by equally special people. They take advantage of others to get what they want. They have an inability or unwillingness to recognize the needs and feelings of others. They can be envious of others and believe others envy them. They can behave in an arrogant way, brag a lot, and come across as conceited. They can insist on having the best of everything, for example, the best car or office. So I just kind of found that interesting and a little bit off topic. But as I was reading those, I was thinking, well, that's a lot of people in this world, mothers or not, but that's neither here nor there. I just kind of thought that you guys may want to look into some of the symptoms, because I was seeing narcissism everywhere, and I was like, where's all this coming from? But how do we heal if you were raised by a single mom that exhibited narcissistic traits? And I really had to sit down and think about this one, because you guys, if you know me, then you know that I am very much a how did we get here person. Yeah, like I got to understand the history of everything. And so I can remember a time in history and, hearing the stories of how, let's just say the early 1900s, women were having a lot of kids. Yep, they sure were. And not only were they, when I say a lot of kids, I'm talking about like 10, 11, 12 plus kids. Because they didn't really, birth control wasn't a thing back then. And then for religious reasons, they didn't believe in birth control. They live by the Lord won't put more on you than you can bear. You know what I mean? But not only were they having a lot of them, they were having them back to back, and they were having them starting at a very early age. And I'm talking about like 13, 14 years old. Those young girls were getting pregnant. I mean, can you imagine? Like starting at 13 and having 11 kids? That's wild, but it happened. And so when you think about the children that were being raised in that household, right? They for sure had parents that were emotionally unavailable. If they were poor, you know what I mean? Because we all know being poor when your money's not right, that's a whole nother mental breakdown. Like that's mentally debilitating, because you're worried about how I'm gonna pay my bills. That's when anxiety and fear starts kicking in, and all of that stuff, right? Yeah. So there was for sure all of those kids that were created and raised up in that home, there were some needs that were not met. And I know, like, we like to talk about, we want the men of today to be more like the men in the past where they were providers. There was a time where women could not get bank accounts, or there were no jobs available for women unless it was like, servant roles. You may be able to go be a maid for, the lady down the street or whatever. Or there were still a lot of them that were out in the fields doing, farmers work, whether it was still picking cotton or, grapes or whatever, right? I don't know. Whatever crop they had. Yep. So when you think about, all of those kids, let's just say you had like 10 kids, you can bet you one or more of those kids were probably on the spectrum somewhere, where they had ADHD, or, something was going on, some type of behavioral health issue was going on, because they were not able to get attention. There's just virtually no way you can pour into 11 kids and you're living in poverty, And then we say the men in the past, but a lot of them, were abusive to their wives and their children. Yep, they would come home from working at the mill or the factory or whatever, and they would get drunk. And some of them left. They would leave their families because it became too much to bear. Or you've heard this a time or two, Grandpa Willie Jean has a whole nother family 2 streets over. Grandma knows about it. But the side chicks, they kind of stayed at bay. They didn't really flaunt it around like that. There was still shame back then, Not the side chicks of today, but, the ones back then, they kind of knew their place. They knew they was messing around with someone's man, and, it was what it was. You know what I'm saying? So, yep. So everything that we're talking about in the social media world is nothing new under the sun. You know what I mean? And so how did we arrive to narcissistic parents, or were they always here? Because it's not just like single moms that are narcissistic, right? You do have well-off moms that are married, connected, and still narcissistic, right? The ones that your kids cannot make a mistake because you're going to ruin the family's name, or they cut them out of their inheritance if they do something against their will. You know what I mean? So it definitely comes in all forms, regardless of race, socioeconomic background, and things of that nature. Yeah. And when you think about like single mothers, young single mothers, teenage single mothers at that, they lacked patience because they were still kids themselves. Yeah. I mean, having all those kids back to back like that at such a young age. And then can you think about the amount of times that they had to go through postpartum depression, didn't even get a chance to heal from the first baby and get to know the first baby before you popping out the next, and then the next, and then the next. You know what I mean? For sure. And then you'll also see with single mothers that exhibit narcissistic traits, they lacked access to resources, but they also failed to kind of teach their kids basic life skills, right? Because they were in such survival mode that they could not find their balance or desire to pour into their children. Yep. So, they often didn't teach children or allow children to trust their judgment. They didn't teach little girls about puberty. A lot of them in an effort to keep young girls from getting pregnant, They would just tell them boys are bad, stay away from boys, but they failed to give them the knowledge. It's almost like you have a pool in your backyard, right? And you have 4 and 5-year-olds, or toddlers, I'll say. Instead of teaching them babies how to swim, just in case they fall in, you just sort of kind of put up a fence and they end up getting in anyway and drowning, right? They fail to teach them like basic life skills, what healthy boundaries look like, and then this is a big one, taking accountability, without completely shutting down or collapsing, because oftentimes it was never talked about like self-love. And whether we want to believe it or not, or accept it or not, since the beginning of time, women have been conditioned to center men. We're just now coming into this decentering men era. And those women that had the abusive husbands, they had to stay because they didn't have no money, no job, no skill set, no nothing. They had to sit there and put up with Grandpa Willie Earl and his nonsense. And then the church also played a big part of that. Stand by your man, pray for your husband. People really valued staying together. Like they just believed that was the way that God wanted you to be. That was the way that God designed it. And if you get rid of your marriage, then you're going against God's will. You know what I mean? So you have kids that were basically, in many cases, raising themselves, or the older siblings was kind of responsible for the younger kids. Those kids were sleeping 5, 6 in one bed. No room for space. So you got the boys that's hitting puberty having to share a room or in bed with his little brothers that are 4 and 5 years old. So that in itself created or did a lot of psychological damage to the kids that were raised up in those homes. They grew up to resent their mothers and are like, why would y'all have all of us and y'all couldn't take care of us? They didn't get a chance to do what they saw their counterparts do, especially if you were black. We couldn't just let our kids run willy-nilly. We had to really keep them on a tight leash. And so I think a lot of narcissistic parenting is deeply rooted in fear. Fear, anxiety, PTSD, depression, and they didn't know how to deal with everything. And most important, they were not shown. Their parents parented them the way that they were parenting their kids. You know what I mean? It's just a generational curse of parenting that is just passed down. But how do you heal from it? What do you do? Because it's not your fault that you were born, right? Your parents were supposed to take care of you. They're the ones that laid down and made you. But then they could say the same thing about their parents, and their parents could say the same thing about them, and which is why it is of my opinion that the system, the American dream, quote unquote, societal pressures and different belief systems has crippled a lot of parents, because on one end, our black men are told that they're supposed to be providers and they were supposed to be the providers. But back then, the white man was still calling them boy. Didn't even see them as men. Wouldn't even address them as men. Couldn't even walk on the same sidewalk. They weren't even respected. Not making any excuses at all. I'm simply explaining the psychology of how did we arrive, or how are narcissistic parents created. Yep. Socioeconomic status, classism, upper class, lower class, middle class. Your worth is based off of how much money you make. So you've got people chasing the bag, right? And then the kids are just fall by the wayside. I talked about that in a previous video to modern times. And you will see like the elderly women now are if they're still with us, people that still have like their great grandparents, they'll ask them, what advice do you have to give a woman? And a lot of those elderly women will say, do not get married and do not have children. And you've got to really be spiritually healthy to kind of understand that, to see what those women mean in the spirit, because you can't take that personal. You can't say that, oh, my mom thought that it was me personally that was bad. No, it was what comes along with raising kids. I think it's what people be resenting, and the promises and the canvas that is painted of how marriage and having children is so lovely, like what you see on TV or what you hear about in the magazines or read about in the books, is far from reality. Yeah. And those young girls that were having those kids and stuff, they resented that. For sure they did. So they probably didn't want those kids suppling on their breast. They were tired. And the kids suffered. So now those kids grow up and they'll either repeat the same thing, or they will look at it and say, that's not how I want to be. And they'll really work on changing things. But we all react to things differently, right? We all grow up and our brains function in a different way, where some people are resilient and it pushes them and propels them to do better. The others fall victim to the generational curse of bad parenting. Yep, for sure. So I don't know. What do you do? Are you guys, you'll also see this real quickly, the ones that were raised by narcissistic parents, they've gone no contact with them. And that breaks my heart. You know what I mean? It really does. And I get it 100%. You got to do what you got to do for your mental health. But I think it's so hard for the parents to take accountability, right? Because accountability, they're taking offense to it, especially for the moms that say, well, I'm the one that stayed. But I'm going to make another video on parents taking accountability for the things that they've done wrong, particularly my single moms, because I've got some advice there. Yep, I sure do. That would be a whole nother long talk, because it's much needed. Yep, and we've got to, those of us that have raised our kids and we realize that our raising them may have not always been the right way, or we may have not always said things in the right way. We've got to start holding these other parents accountable and saying, look, sis, look, brother, it's okay. It's just another thing we're going to get through. Let's just get through this hurdle, heal, so that our kids, because we know that you love your kids. Well, we hope that you love them anyway, right? But that's another video for another day. Yeah. So they didn't have the patience. They were poor. They were stressed out. And a lot of them were just babies, like a 13-year-old and pregnant. Like, think about that. That's wild. That's crazy. That child was in no condition to be a mother. Yep. Surely was not. And the systems that have set in place, the dreams that we have been sold, people are waking up out of that slumber, honey. They're saying, these women are saying, like, nah, I do not want to use my body as a vessel to bring children into the world, for a world that's going to hate my children, that is not going to be providing a future for my children, a safe space for my children, don't like my children just because of the color of their skin. Like, a lot of women are waking up from that. Men too. And there are a lot of men that are realizing too how patriarchy hurt them and how it created narcissism in them as well, because they are told that they have to be this way, but the access to do it, there's no even playing field, right? The ones that are telling you this is all of what you can achieve are the ones that own it, or are the ones that are setting the rules. It's crazy. So that's how I think that narcissistic single mothers were created, And if you are a victim of being raised by a narcissistic parent, my advice, sweetheart, is to heal. Get into therapy for sure, because I'll say this for me. When I look back on how I was raised, when you get older, resenting the way that you were raised is very much a real thing. It's very much a real thing. And it can make you look at your life choices. Well, why didn't anyone tell me this? Or how come my mom and dad didn't tell me that? You know, and you can also think like, dang, if someone had just poured a little bit more into me, or had supported me a little bit more, or had taken up the time with me, oh, the places I could have gone, oh, the woman that I could have been, you know, and that can make you angry. Yeah, it really can. But, you know, for me, I had to look at the intent behind everything. Like as much as my mom got some things wrong, I feel like she got everything right that I needed to be where I'm at today. And there were some hard trials and tribulations that I had to learn on my own. Yes, for sure. Am I excusing what she did? Absolutely, I'm not. You know what I mean? But we weren't hungry. You know, we did not have clothes on our back, or we did not have clothes on our back. Like, we were fed. My mom made a lot of sacrifices to move us to a bigger city so that we can attend a good school district. You know, my brother had all of the latest sneakers and things like that, you know, and she fed us, and she took very good care of us. You know, and those are the things that I have to kind of hold on to, because I'm telling you now, if you sit in the woulda, coulda, shoulda, it only just keeps you stagnant. So that's why I'm a huge proponent of getting into therapy, for sure. Getting into therapy and healing, you know. And if you do have a parent that's just never going to take accountability, well, then you've got to cut ties with that and let that be where that is, because it's not your responsibility to beg someone to see what they did wrong, right? And you've got to find a way to forgive, not for them, but for you. Because you'll hold on to that, and it'll show up in other areas of your life. You now know what you suffer from. You now know, you know, that your parents didn't get it right while raising you, but what happened to you is not your fault, but your healing is definitely your responsibility. You know, and for me, what helped me was, you know, not only did I look at the intent right, but then I said to myself, well, the things that she didn't do right, no one taught her. And I wonder, you know, what all did she go through as a child? Because my mom was not the type to just open up, and she died when I was 23. So, you know, that was it'll be 23 years this year. Yep, 23 years. You know, so, you know, at the end of the day, I thought to myself, I bet there were some things that she went through, because, you know, Black families like to sweep a lot of stuff up under the rug. Yep. And then those family members, I've said it, you know, they gossip like they're Wendy Williams getting paid on a talk show, shaming, you know, those teenagers for getting pregnant instead of helping them, all while they were pregnant teenagers. Crazy, right? You know, but it happens. You know, someone shamed them for getting pregnant, and now that they've, you know, raised their kids, now their teenagers pregnant, now they're upset, you know, going around slandering your kids' name all in the family and stuff, telling all their business. I tell my single mothers, get your kids away from them gossiping ass family members. Excuse my language. Get them away from them. You know, because you can talk about people, but if you're not there to help, shut your mouth. Zip up your lips, especially if you're in no better position, you know. And a lot of that can, especially if they were young, can really stun a person's growth, like arrested development, for sure. But I don't know. You guys drop a comment. What are your thoughts on it? How are you healing? You know, how's therapy been working for you guys? How did you get through it? If it's something that you've already kind of worked your way through, right? Drop a comment below. But to my single mommies, you got this, mamas. I love you guys. Till next time. Bye.